President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I thank the chair. Madam President, I rise to speak as if in morning business. I rise to speak specifically about the alarming situation in Syria, where the regime of Bashar al Assad is pursuing a barbaric campaign of indiscriminate repression against the Syrian people. Over the past 2 weeks, the crackdown pursued by Assad has markedly escalated. There can no longer be any doubt about his intentions. As a report by the respected non-governmental organization, the International Crisis Group, warned this week, and I quote, "The regime's hope appears to be that a massive crackdown can bring the protesters to heel." And I continue to quote, "Such a course of action would entail loss of life on a massive scale, and it could usher in a period of sectarian fighting with devastating consequences for Syria. It could destabilize its neighbors, and ultimately, it is highly unlikely to work." End of quote. Madam President, in the city of Daraa, the Assad regime has deployed tanks against the civilian population. It has cut off phone lines, water, food, and electricity, and deployed snipers, according to human rights groups, who have been firing at anyone who ventures outdoors. And that includes young people who are sent outdoors by their families to try to buy some food. In short, what we see in Daraa is a broad-based, indiscriminate assault by Assad's military forces against the people of his own country. The evidence is growing that international crimes are being perpetrated by Bashar al Assad himself in the city of Daraa in Syria. The attack on Daraa is just one part, of course, of a broader crackdown by Syrian security forces across the country, a crackdown that has left several hundred people dead. Tanks and military forces have been reported being deployed in other cities in Syria. According to Human Rights Watch, the number of arbitrary detentions of civilians and enforced disappearances around the country has skyrocketed in recent days, as the Assad regime has swept up not only demonstrators, but women, minors, and family members of activists. Another Syrian human rights group has documented more than 500 arrests in Daraa alone since last week, and thousands more nationwide have also been detained or disappeared arbitrarily. As that report by the International Crisis Group that I referenced before that came out earlier this week argued, and again I quote, "The regime is also fanning the flames of sectarianism, spreading rumors of impending acts targeting specific groups. Sectarian tendencies no doubt exist in parts of the country, but the authorities' tactics betray a determined and cynical attempt to exploit and exasperate them." What's most remarkable of all is that in the face of and despite these outrageous, inhumane actions by the Assad regime, the people of Syria refuse to be silenced. They refuse to be intimidated. In the face of tanks and snipers, the people of Syria have continued to cry out and demonstrate for their fundamental human rights. And they have continued to do so peacefully. Moreover, despite the sectarian provocations by President Assad, the message of the protesters has remained steadfastly one of Syrian national unity. Tomorrow, Friday, it is expected that thousands of brave Syrians will once again take to the streets of their cities and towns in protest of the totalitarian dictatorship that currently controls their country. As they do so, I want them to know that the United States and the rest of the civilized world stands unequivocally on the side of the people of Syria, in solidarity with them in their courageous struggle for their human rights. And they should know also that we are increasingly confident that the people of Syria can and will prevail over the Assad regime. There's much we here in the United States can and must do to help the Syrian people in their fight for freedom. Last week, the Obama administration issued an executive order authorizing targeted sanctions against individuals and organizations responsible for the human rights abuses in Syria. The administration used this newest authority to sanction 3 Syrian officials, including Bashar al Assad, the brother of Bashar al Assad. This was a very important action, and I thank and commend the Obama administration for taking it. There is, however, more that now can and must be done. To begin with, it's clear that there are many more individuals in the Syrian government than the 3 names so far who are responsible for the human rights abuses and worse that are taking place throughout Syria. It's urgent and essential that the Obama administration expand the sanctions to cover these additional Syrian officials. Members of the Syrian security forces and government must understand that they face a choice in the days ahead. If they stick with the Assad regime and participate in the barbaric crackdown against their fellow Syrians, their names are going to be made famous around the world, and they will be held accountable. It's also critical that the United States impose sanctions on Bashar al Assad himself, for he is the head of the regime that is systematically carrying out large-scale human rights abuses. It is he who is directing his military forces to fire on his own people. Surely it requires a willing suspension of disbelief to think that the order to use military force against the Syrian people did not originate with the president of Syria himself, Bashar al Assad. He must be held accountable. I respectfully urge President Obama to speak out as soon as possible, directly and personally, about what's happening in Syria. For the moral authority of the President of the United States matters enormously at historic moments like the one in Syria now. Unfortunately, there are still many in Syria and throughout the Middle East who believe that the United States is hedging its bets in Syria. It's time to put those doubts to rest. I've met over the last few weeks, as recently as yesterday, with Syrian dissidents. And I've heard the same question from them again and again. Why has President Obama not spoken out personally about what is happening in Syria, they ask. I say the administration has made statements. They say we need to hear and see the president and hear his voice, President Obama, making clear his disdain and refusal to accept what's happening in Syria today. And so I respectfully urge the president to answer these appeals by Syrian freedom fighters for support of their cause. I hope that the president can make clear, once again, as he did so effectively in the cases of Egypt and Libya, that Bashar al Assad has lost the legitimacy to lead Syria, and it is time for Bashar to go. The United States can also work with our allies and partners to increase international pressure on the Assad regime. Press reports indicate, I'm pleased to note, that the European Union is preparing to put in place an arms embargo against Syria, and that it is also considering targeted human rights sanctions against top Syrian officials. I fervently hope that our European friends and allies take these and further steps to increase the pressure on the Assad regime. I am especially encouraged that the French foreign minister this week correctly called for Bashar al Assad to be sanctioned directly himself, to tie up his economic assets, to limit his mobility. In addition to our EU partners, Madam President, I want to say that I believe Turkey can also play a unique leadership role in the days and weeks ahead to support a successful democratic transition in Syria. No one has worked harder than Prime Minister Erdogan to encourage Bashar al Assad to reform, to accept the legitimate demands of the Syrian people and embrace democracy. Unfortunately, despite these efforts, Assad has ignored the wise counsel of the Turkish leader and refused to respond with action. I therefore hope that President Obama will find a way to partner directly with Prime Minister Erdogan on developing a new strategy towards Syria, one that recognizes that despite our hopes and efforts, there will be no real progress as long as Bashar al Assad remains in power in Damascus. A policy that aligns our two democracies, America and Turkey, unequivocally with the democratic aspirations of the Syrian people. We should also work, Madam President, with our allies on the UN Human Rights Council to ensure that the investigative mission to Syria, which was agreed upon by the Council last week, is undertaken immediately. Every day matters. And we should work to refer Assad's regime to the International Criminal Court, again, as we did in the case of Libya. And what the Assad regime is doing to the people of Syria looks every day more the mirror image of what the Gaddafi regime has done to the people of Libya. For its actions in the city of Daraa and throughout the country, the Assad regime deserves to be investigated by the International Criminal Court. I respectfully urge our own administration to use the diplomatic clout that we have at the United Nations to put what's happening in Syria on the agenda of the UN Security Council. I have no illusions about the challenges and obstacles that exist at the Security Council at this time to taking action with regard to what's happening in Syria. But we must try. If the Security Council fails to take up what is happening in Syria, perhaps because of the opposition of the Russians and the Chinese, it does so at the expense of its own international credibility and legitimacy. And finally, Madam President, I hope that President Obama will work together with our international allies to provide the Syrian people with the humanitarian assistance that they urgently need: food, water, and medical supplies, and to restore communications linkages that the Assad regime has cut among the freedom fighters in various communities in Syria. Assad has cut them in an offer to prevent news and information about what's happening in Syria also from reaching the outside world. Madam President, the situation in Syria is fast approaching the point of no return. The fact is that several hundred Syrians have been killed by Assad's security forces. This is a regime that I conclude is beyond self-correction. Bashar al Assad is not a reformer. He is a corrupt dictator and an inhumane thug, and his regime has long been one of the worst in the Middle East. It is time for him to go. So let me conclude by adding that nearly a decade after the attacks of September 11th, Americans and people throughout the world awoke Monday morning to a safer, better world with Osama bin Laden gone. It is fitting, Madam President, that Osama bin Laden has been killed just as Arab democracies across the Middle East and North Africa are being born, are coming to life. The peaceful, youth-driven democratic revolutions now taking place in Syria, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya are the true repudiation of the extreme ideology that I will call bin Ladenism, to rid our world not only of bin Laden, but of bin Ladenism. It is critical that we now do everything in our power to help the democratic forces in Syria and across the Middle East succeed. For it will ultimately be, quite correctly and powerfully, at the hands of his fellow Arabs and Muslims that the hateful and violent ideology of bin Laden and its manifestations of a different sort in dictatorships across the Middle East are finally discredited and abandoned in the ash heap of history where they belong. I thank the chair. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call.